Hey guys, Matt at Dungeon Crawl Minis here. Welcome back for another video. Today we'll be painting two more of the Reaper Nagendra, which are the Archer and the Second Warrior. I decided to paint two at once this time and just save myself a little bit of time. I have a massive backlog to get through, and for the sake of variety I thought I would speed things up a little bit and not record every single figure that I'm going to paint. I've gone for a slightly different colour scheme this time, which will be red for the shadows, moving up to orange for the body and white for the highlights. And for this video I made an absolutely massive mistake, which was to try and shoot in 4K. Now in theory that works fine and my phone's perfectly capable of it, but when I tried to edit that on my aging 6-year-old computer, let's just say that mistakes were made and I had to end up converting all of the footage back down to 1080p in order for my computer to be able to handle it without dying. So learn from my mistakes, and if you have a 6-year-old computer like I do, I would suggest just sticking to 1080p. For these minis we'll be using a standard series of techniques, starting with the base coat, doing some shading, and highlighting and dry brushing. These are the brushes that I'll be using. The angle brush will be for base coating, the medium-sized brush with a decent tip for some touch-ups and details, and a makeup brush for dry brushing. Let's look at the paints we'll be using. For the shadows we'll be using scale colour Kalahari orange, and this is one of my absolute favourite colours. I really just can't use this enough. For the base coat we'll be using Mars orange by scale colour, and for the dry brushing and highlights we'll be using white sands, which is an almost white yellow. For the leather parts of the figures we'll be using Dubai brown, which is a gorgeous deep brown colour, almost a kind of chocolate brown, and we'll be highlighting that into Vallejo Game Earth. For the stomach we'll be using Vallejo dark sea blue, and we'll be mixing that with some Liquitex white ink to make some different shades. For shading we'll be using Citadel Druchii violet, and to paint the base we'll be using Vallejo black paint and black ink mixed 50-50. And for the metallics I'll be using the same as before, Vallejo metal steel, silver and gold. The first step is to thin our paint to the right consistency, and with scale colour they are very thick. As you can see here, if we just try and pull this around the palette unthinned, it's far too thick. It's just going to clog up all the detail on the mini. So I bring in a drop or two of flow improver. If you don't have that you can just use water, tap water's fine, and I give it a good mix. As I drag the brush through it again, you can see that it now has thinned out, and if I drag the brush through, the wake that is left behind just kind of fills in on its own and it starts to level itself out. This means that this is about the right consistency for painting. By way of comparison, here is a drop of paint of the Game Air range by Vallejo. This is one drop and you can see it. It's just so much more fluid immediately as I can pull this around the palette. It's probably a little too thin to paint with in the brush, but if it's all you have, it is better than nothing. So, let's start with the base coating. So here we'll start with the shadows, going in with Kalahari orange, basing all of those, and then once that's done we will clean the brush and move up to Mars orange and cover the rest of the figure. I am not being neat about this, and at this point there really isn't a ton of value in being precise with the edges, so I just want to get the colour onto the figure in the right places and we can clean that up later. If you are painting in reds and oranges and yellows in particular, then you do need to be aware of just how transparent these paints are, and they will look like they're not covering very well. As you can see here, it can take several coats to get the coverage that you want, and this took between 3 and 4 coats to cover. So with the oranges done, it was time to move on to the belly, and here I had hit another problem, which is that I didn't know what colour I wanted to use for this, and I had trouble just looking at my paint box being inspired. And sometimes this happens. When painting, you won't necessarily have all of the colours picked out in advance, so to make sure I didn't pick a colour that would clash, I used a colour wheel and colour theory. So let's talk about those for a second. Basically, if you don't know what these are, colour theory is basically applying a logical structure to colour, and the most common artistic use is the colour wheel, which is a circle that shows all of the colours in relation to each other by hue. Now you can get a physical one of these, which I have, or you can use an online tool. I use one on canva.com. I will drop a link into the description below. Now this online one is pretty good. You just select the colour in the wheel and use the drop down, and it will give you the combinations that you want, and there are really a couple of choices. The first one is complementary colours. This is what I ended up using for my figure, but we'll come back to it. You can do monochromatic, which is different shades of the same colour. Next is analogous, which are colours that are side by side on the wheel. And then you have triadic and beyond, which go into multiple colours. I went back to a complementary colour for this mini. So we'll be going in with Vallejo Dark Sea Green and just applying that to all of the stomach sections. Once that's done, I will go back in with Mars Orange and just clean up some of those edges with the fine detail brush. Once that's done, we can move on to the leather areas, which will be the bows, belt, braces, things like that. For now, this will just be Dubai Brown, but we'll come back later with some of the earth and add some highlights. So once all of those colours are applied, we'll be going back into the stomach area. So I have a lot of paints, but it turns out that I don't have a lot of teal colour paints, so I'm going to have to mix my own. We'll start with Vallejo Dark Sea Blue, and I'm adding a little bit of Liquitex white ink into it, into what turns out to be a 1:2 and 1:3 ratio. The initial mix here that you see was just too dark, there wasn't enough light in between the shades, so I just came back and added a little bit more ink. The reason I'm using ink for this is that inks tend to carry far more pigment inside them than paints do, so I should get a very strong push up to white from using it. They're also thinner than paints, so I shouldn't have to thin this with additional water or flow improver. It should be about the right consistency by the time I'm done mixing. And this is where we start to wet blend again. So the first thing I'm going to do is to take my paint into the base colour and apply that just so that the lighter shade has something to grab onto. And then without cleaning the brush at all, I go back and pick up the lighter shade and apply that as well. Now I can rinse the brush, and after just drying it off, I come back in and start to blend the two colours together. As you can see the effect almost immediately, the transition just smooths out instantly and starts to look much better. This is a process that I will need to repeat a couple of times in order for it to look good, just going back between the darker colour and the lighter colour until I get a smooth transition that I'm happy with. I'm actually going to leave this footage unedited and not speed it up, just so that you guys can see roughly how long it takes to do this if you're trying this yourself, and also so that you can see that it's not an instant process and it does take a few tries and it takes some time. We'll come back and do a little bit more of this later once this has dried. Next we have the shield on the warrior, which will be exactly the same as the other miniature. I'll be going into the details with gold, and the metallics will be done with steel and highlighting into silver. Now, the weapon on this guy gave me a ton of problems. The detail on the sword was really lacking, and I think it was either a sculpting issue or a moulding issue, and this wasn't a particularly clean pull. In the end, I just had to basically freehand the gold into the sword and just guess where the runes were. So it might be a little bit hard to see on the camera here. I've tried to zoom in, so apologies if the quality is not that great. But there's some very nice detailing on the bow. There's some raised areas that I could do a lighter shade of brown. I chose to make the metal plates instead, make it look like more of a war bow, if that is a thing. In a fantasy world, it probably is. Next, I am going to come back in with more of the metallics, the silver, to hit things like the belt buckles and the armor buckles, and I will come in with the gold and hit the emblem that is attached to the quiver of the archer. Once all that base coating is finally completed, here's what they look like. Next is the wash, and this is probably the easiest step. It is 100% Druchii Violet, and I'm just going in with my angle brush here, or any large brush. For washing purposes, you probably want to use an old brush. A brush that is knackered is a really good brush to use here. Something that you don't really care about, because it's just going to be bashed around a lot as you're trying to hit all the parts of the mini. What I do need to take care of here is that if there's any large flat areas of the model, that the wash doesn't start to pool on top of that, because as soon as that starts to happen, you can get something called coffee staining. And coffee staining is exactly what it sounds like. It is where you get this horrible blotchy looking stain on the mini, and it is an absolute pain to try and get rid of. You have to kind of paint over it, and getting that to blend with what you've just done can be very, very difficult. I'm going to try to mitigate that here where I see it happening, just by going back in with the brush, wicking that off, and coming back in to get rid of any excess wash. Once that's dry, here's what it looks like. As is the case with any wash on a mini, it's going to push all of the highlights down, so the next step is to come back in and reapply those. I'm picking out the top of the shield here with the silver paint, and I'm just picking up the rim or the top of the shield where the light would catch it, and also this symbol in the middle. You can see that it really got stained purple, and that is not a look that I wanted. I'm going to also come back in with the gold paint and just touch up the recesses and the symbol in the middle of the shield. I'm also going to hit the tops of the metal plates with the silver just to bring a highlight back in, and things like the belt buckle and the armor buckles. A little bit of the stomach also got washed out, so this is where I'm just coming back in with some of that lighter shade I mixed and reapplying it. Now we move on to dry brushing. So this is the brush that I'm using. It's a makeup brush, barely cost me anything. And we're going to go back in with Mars Orange first of all. And this is the technique. I got a little paint on the brush, and then I have some kitchen towel, and I'm really just brushing off almost everything. You can see here, I also test it on the back of my hand, just to see if it leaves a big streak or not. If it does, then I need to get rid of more. Once I'm happy with that, I will just come in and hit all of the higher parts of the figure. If you're new to this, then a good technique is to look at it from the top down, and you'll naturally see the parts where the light would hit. I've also come back in with a detail brush and the same orange just to pick out a few highlights that I wanted. Then we move on to the second dry brush, which is the White Sands by Scale 75, and I've actually swapped to a slightly smaller brush here, and again, just hitting the tops of the Mini, and this is the point where I feel that this really comes together. The colours start to shift and blend a little bit, and it just ends up looking really, really nice. I did have to repeat this process perhaps 2 or 3 times to pick up the level of colour I wanted, but here is a close-up, and as you can see, it's looking really good. Next, we'll come back in with the Vallejo Earth, and we will start to pick out some of the highlights on the leather areas. This is going to be things like the top and bottom of the quiver, and the middle of the leather straps that make up the armor where the light would catch it. Next, we're painting the feathered part of the arrows with White Sands paint. Now, this is going over a dark colour, so it's going to take a few coats to cover that and look good. And here is the finished Mini. As always, thank you for watching. I hope you found this useful. Please leave a comment below if there's anything else that you would like to see, know more about, any suggestions. I would greatly appreciate it. Thanks, and see you next time.